5 years ago, Elara fled her own wedding to Alpha King Darian moments before the ceremony, terrified of a war she believed her marriage would ignite. She vanished, changed her name, and trained as a healer in a distant village. A jagged scar along her jaw from the night she escaped, now marking a face he no longer recognizes. When his court is struck by a mysterious illness, fate drags her back to the one place she swore never to return, his castle, as the healer summoned to save him. Elara had spent 5 years learning to be someone else. New name, new scar, new life built quietly in a village far from anywhere that mattered, far from the castle she'd fled on the morning of her own wedding, far from the man she'd left standing at an altar without a single word of explanation. She'd told herself the distance was permanent, that whatever she'd run from that day was buried deep enough to stay buried. Then the fever swept through the royal court, and every healer within 3 kingdoms was summoned to the capital, including, apparently, her. She almost refused, almost sent someone else in her place, invented an illness of her own, did anything except walk back through those castle gates. But healers didn't get to choose which patients needed them, and when she was led into the royal chambers and saw who lay fevered and pale in that enormous bed, 5 years of careful distance collapsed in a single breath. Alpha King Darian opened his eyes, fever-bright and unfocused, and looked directly at the scar along her jaw, like he was trying to place something just out of reach. "Have we met?" he rasped. Alara's throat closed around every word she might have said instead. "No, Your Majesty," she lied. "I don't believe we have." The messenger arrived at dawn, mud-splattered from 3 days of hard riding, demanding every healer in the village present themselves for royal service before the sun set that evening. Elara had been grinding willow bark for fever tonics when she heard the commotion outside, and something cold settled in her stomach the moment she caught the words "royal court" and "capital" in the same breath. "You should go," said Mabel, the elderly healer who'd trained her these past 5 years, watching Alara's hands go suddenly still over the mortar and pestle. "You're the most skilled among us. If the king's court needs healers, you're obligated same as anyone." "I have reasons I can't go," Elara said carefully. Mabel's sharp eyes studied her for a long moment, the same eyes that had never once asked about the scar along Alara's jaw or the careful way she avoided any conversation touching the capital or the false name she'd carried for 5 years without explanation. "Whatever those reasons are," Mabel said gently, "they're not reasons the royal messenger outside is prepared to accept. Refusing a direct summons from the crown carries consequences neither of us can afford, Elara. Whatever you're running from will still be there whether you go or not. At least if you go on your own terms, rather than dragged there by soldiers." Elara closed her eyes, feeling 5 years of careful distance beginning to crumble before she'd even left the village. "It's Wren now," she said quietly, an old habit of correction. "Not Elara. I buried that name a long time ago." "Wren, then," Mabel allowed, though her expression suggested she'd never quite believed the false name covered whatever truth lay beneath it. "Pack your satchel. The capital won't wait forever, and neither will whatever illness has taken hold there." The journey to the capital took 2 full days, during which Elara turned over every possible explanation for why fate had chosen this particular moment to drag her back toward a life she'd sworn never to return to. She told herself it was simple bad luck, a royal summons that happened to require her specific skill with fever tonics, nothing more sinister than coincidence and timing. She told herself Darian wouldn't recognize her. 5 years had changed her face, thinned by hardship and healer's work rather than the softer comfort of palace life. The scar along her jaw, earned the very night she'd fled, catching herself badly on a broken window latch in her desperate rush to escape, marked her as thoroughly different from the woman who'd once worn silk gowns and practiced careful court smiles. She told herself all of this, and believed almost none of it, dread coiling tighter in her chest with every mile closer to the capital's looming towers. The castle hadn't changed. Same gray stone walls, same wolf crest banners hanging from the ramparts, same enormous iron gates she'd once ridden through as a bride-to-be, full of dread even then, though for entirely different reasons than the dread currently gripping her. A castle steward met her at the gates, checking her name against a list of summoned healers. Wren, village healer? Yes, Elara said, the lie settling easier now, worn smooth by 5 years of practice. You're needed immediately in the royal chambers. The king's fever worsened overnight. General Vance will explain the situation. Elara followed the steward through corridors she remembered with unsettling clarity. The same tapestries, the same worn stone steps, the same enormous doors leading toward the royal wing where she'd once imagined spending the rest of her life as Darian's wife and queen. Instead, she was walking toward him now as a stranger, armed with herbs and healing skill rather than any right to be there at all, praying desperately that 5 years and a jagged scar had changed her enough to remain safely unrecognized. General Vance met her outside the royal chambers, his weathered face carved with the particular exhaustion of a man who hadn't slept properly in days. "You're the healer from the western village," he said, more statement than question, studying her with tired but sharp eyes. "Wren, was it?" "Yes, General." Elara kept her voice steady, professional. "I understand the king's fever has worsened." "Worsened and spreading. 3 of his personal guard have fallen ill since yesterday, and 2 kitchen staff besides." Vance guided her toward the heavy chamber doors. "The other healers are treating the guard and staff. You've been requested specifically for the king himself. Apparently, your reputation for fever treatment precedes you, even this far from your village." Elara's stomach tightened at the word specifically, wondering distantly who had recommended her by name, and whether that recommendation carried any weight beyond simple professional reputation. The royal chambers were dim, curtains drawn against daylight, the air thick with the particular mixture of sweat and herbs that always accompanied serious fever. Alpha King Darian lay in an enormous bed at the room's center, sandy blonde hair damp against his forehead, chest rising and falling in shallow, uneven breaths. Elara's breath caught despite 5 years of careful preparation for exactly this moment. He looked older than she remembered, harder somehow. New lines carved around his eyes that hadn't existed when she'd last seen him standing at an altar, waiting for a bride who never arrived. But it was unmistakably him, the same strong jaw, the same broad shoulders, the same face she'd once imagined waking up beside for the rest of her life before fear had convinced her otherwise. "Your Majesty," Vance said, voice gentler than a Larden general, "the healer from the western village is here." Darian's eyes fluttered open, fever-bright and unfocused, and found Elara's face with visible effort. For one terrible moment, Elara was certain he recognized her instantly, certain 5 years and a jagged scar had changed nothing at all, certain she was about to be exposed as the coward bride who'd fled her own wedding without explanation. Instead, Darian's fevered gaze moved slowly across her face, confusion evident beneath the illness clouding his expression. Have we met? He rasped, voice rough and unfamiliar with sickness. You seem. He paused, brow furrowing like he was chasing a memory just out of reach. Familiar, somehow. Elara's throat closed around every honest response available to her. No, Your Majesty, she said instead, the lie coming easier than she expected, though it left something bitter and hollow in her chest afterward. I don't believe we have. I'm Ren, healer from the Western Village. I've come to treat your fever. Darian studied her a moment longer, something unresolved flickering behind fever-glazed eyes before exhaustion apparently won out, his head falling back against the pillow. Then treat it, he murmured, eyes closing again. Whatever this illness is, it's spreading faster than my physicians can manage alone. Elara moved to his bedside with practiced efficiency, checking his pulse, the heat radiating from his skin, the particular pallor that suggested something beyond ordinary seasonal fever. How long has he been like this? She asked Vance, following into the professional rhythm that had carried her through 5 years of healer's work. 4 days, Vance said. Started as ordinary fever, but it's worsened rapidly. Nothing our physicians have tried has slowed it, and now it's spreading to others in the castle. Elara examined the pattern of Darian's symptoms more carefully, the particular flush along his skin, the faint rash beginning to appear at his collar, symptoms that suggested something considerably more specific than ordinary illness. General, she said slowly, dread building in her chest for reasons entirely separate from her own hidden identity. Has anyone considered this might not be natural illness at all? Vance's expression sharpened immediately. What do you mean? I mean, Elara said, examining the rash pattern once more to confirm her suspicion, that I've seen fever like this only once before, in a village that turned out to be suffering deliberate poisoning rather than natural sickness. If I'm right, General, someone in this castle may be trying to kill your king rather slowly, through methods that look convincingly like ordinary disease. Word of Elara's suspicion reached the rest of the castle faster than she anticipated, carried by anxious servants and worried guards, until it landed, inevitably, at the door of Darian's younger sister. Maeve arrived at the royal chambers within the hour, sandy blonde hair pulled back hastily, pale blue court gown wrinkled from obvious haste, sharp hazel eyes immediately finding Elara across the dim room. You're the healer who thinks my brother is being poisoned, Maeve said, no preamble, studying Elara with an intensity that made her want to shrink back toward the shadows. I believe it's possible, Elara said carefully. The symptom pattern doesn't match natural fever as closely as I'd expect. I'd need to examine what he's been eating and drinking these past several days to know for certain. Then examine it, Maeve said immediately. Whatever you need, General Vance will provide. If someone in this castle is trying to kill my brother, I want them found before they succeed. Elara nodded, already turning her attention back to Darian's fevered form, cataloging symptoms with the careful precision 5 years of training had instilled in her. You're very calm about this possibility, Maeve observed, watching her work. Most healers I've dealt with panic at the suggestion of deliberate poisoning within royal walls. Panic doesn't help patients. I've learned to set it aside until the work is finished. Maeve steadied her a moment longer, something assessing in her expression that made Elara distinctly uncomfortable. You remind me of someone, she said finally, though I can't quite place who. Elara's pulse quickened. I have one of those faces, I suppose. Common enough features. Perhaps, Maeve allowed, though her tone suggested she wasn't entirely convinced. Over the following hours, Elara worked methodically through every possible source of poison. Food, water, the herbal treatments Darian's previous physicians had already administered, even the candles burning in his chamber, in case something in the wax carried toxic properties. She found the answer in his evening wine, a subtle bitterness beneath the usual flavor that most palates would never notice, but that her herbalist training recognized immediately. Night bloom root, she told Vance and Maeve, both gathered anxiously at her announcement. Administered slowly, in small doses over several days, designed to mimic natural fever rather than obvious poisoning. Whoever did this understood herbalism well enough to make it convincing. Who has access to his wine? Maeve demanded. Kitchen staff, personal attendants, anyone who serves his meals directly, Vance said grimly. Which narrows our suspects considerably, but doesn't eliminate enough of them to act quickly. I can prepare an antidote, Elara said, already reaching for her satchel. Nightbloom poisoning responds well to concentrated silverleaf tea if caught before permanent damage occurs. He should recover fully within several days, assuming the poisoning stops immediately. And if it doesn't stop? Maeve asked. If whoever's responsible simply finds another method. Then we need guards on everything entering his chambers, Elara said. Food, drink, even the water used for washing. Until we identify who's responsible, nothing reaches him without inspection first. Vance nodded grimly, already moving to arrange the necessary security, leaving Elara alone with Maeve and the fevered king for the first time since her arrival. You're skilled, Maeve said quietly, watching Elara prepare the antidote with practiced efficiency. Unusually skilled for a village healer treating royal poisoning cases. Where did you say you trained? I didn't say, Elara replied carefully, focusing on measuring Silverleaf with more attention than the task strictly required. Maeve's sharp eyes lingered on her a moment longer, something knowing beginning to surface behind her assessing expression, before she simply nodded and turned her attention back toward her fevered brother. Save him, she said quietly. Whatever else you're not telling us, healer, save my brother, and we'll worry about the rest of it afterward. Elara nodded, throat tight with unspoken truths, and turned back to the antidote with hands that trembled slightly despite her best efforts at composure. Just a little longer, she told herself. Save him, and disappear again before anyone looks closely enough to recognize what I'm actually hiding. The antidote worked faster than Elara dared hope. By the second dose, Darian's fever had broken enough that he slept peacefully rather than tossing through fevered dreams, his breathing steady and even for the first time since her arrival. Elara remained at his bedside through the night, monitoring his recovery with the same careful attention she gave every patient, though something about this particular vigil felt heavier, weighted with 5 years of memory she'd spent considerable effort trying to bury. She'd forgotten how he looked when he slept peacefully, forgotten the particular way his features softened without the weight of command holding them rigid, forgotten how young he actually was beneath all that royal authority and responsibility. She hadn't forgotten enough, she realized, not nearly enough. Maeve found her there near dawn, having apparently abandoned any attempt at sleep herself. He looks better, she observed, studying her brother's peaceful expression. The antidote is working as expected, Elara confirmed. He should wake within the hour, considerably more lucid than he's been in days. And when he wakes, Maeve said carefully, will he recognize the healer who saved him? Or will you have already disappeared back toward whatever western village you came from? Elara's hands stilled over her herb satchel. I intend to see his full recovery through before I leave, if that's what you're asking. That's not quite what I'm asking, Maeve said, settling into the chair opposite Elara with obvious purpose. I've been trying to place your face since you arrived, healer. something familiar in your features, despite that scar changing your jaw considerably from whatever face I'm half remembering. Elara's pulse quickened, panic rising sharp and immediate. I have common features, as I mentioned, easy enough to mistake for someone else. Perhaps, Maeve allowed, though her sharp eyes suggested she wasn't remotely convinced. Or perhaps you remind me of someone specific, a woman I haven't seen in exactly 5 years, who vanished the morning of her own wedding without a single word of explanation to anyone who loved her. The words landed like a physical blow, and Elara felt every careful piece of her disguise threatening to crumble at once. I don't know what you're suggesting, she managed, though her voice wavered enough to betray the lie. I'm suggesting, Maeve said, gentler now, though no less direct, that my brother spent 2 years searching for Elara before finally accepting she was gone for good. I watched what her disappearance did to him, healer. I watched a strong, confident man become someone guarded and distant, convinced love itself was a weakness that cost him everything eventually. I'm sorry for whatever pain your brother experienced, Elara said carefully, but I fail to see what that has to do with me. Perhaps nothing, or perhaps everything. I won't force a confession from you, healer, if you're not ready to give one, but I'd ask you to consider something before you disappear again, assuming you are who I suspect you are. And what's that? Whatever fear drove you away 5 years ago, my brother deserves to know the truth now, rather than continuing to grieve a woman who's apparently very much alive, treating his poisoning as though she were nothing more than a stranger passing through. Elara said nothing, throat too tight for words, torn between 5 years of careful self-preservation and the growing weight of guilt Maeve's words had settled directly onto her chest. Darian stirred before either woman could continue the conversation further, brown eyes opening slowly, considerably clearer than they'd been throughout his fever. "Maeve?" he murmured, voice still rough, but no longer confused by illness. His gaze shifted toward Elara, studying her with new lucidity that made her stomach drop entirely. "And you're the healer who's apparently been keeping me alive these past 2 days." "Ren, Your Majesty," Elara said, the false name feeling more hollow with every repetition. "I'm relieved to see your fever has broken." Darian studied her face for a long, considering moment, something working behind his brown eyes that made Elara's heart hammer with dread. "Ren," he repeated slowly, like he was testing the name against some memory that refuses to quite settle into place. "Forgive me. You still seem remarkably familiar, healer. I can't quite place why." Behind him, Elara caught Maeve's knowing gaze and understood with sinking certainty that her carefully maintained disguise was beginning to unravel considerably faster than she'd prepared herself for. General Vance arrived within the hour, expression grim in a way that immediately drew everyone's attention away from the tension simmering between Darian and his healer. "We've identified the source," Vance said, without preamble. "One of the kitchen staff, a woman named Corla, has been missing since this morning. Guards found Nightbloom root hidden in her quarters, along with correspondence suggesting she wasn't acting alone." "Correspondence from whom?" Darian asked, pushing himself up against his pillows despite obvious lingering weakness. "Unsigned," Vance said grimly, "but the handwriting matches documents we've intercepted before from agents loyal to the Northern Territories, territories that have made no secret of their displeasure regarding your recent trade agreements." Darian's jaw tightened. They'd risk war over trade disputes? They'd risk considerably more than that, apparently, if it meant removing you before those agreements could be fully implemented, Vance said. I've already dispatched additional guards throughout the castle. Whoever assisted Corla in this plot remains unidentified, which means the danger hasn't necessarily passed simply because her poisoning has been discovered. Elara listened to this exchange with growing unease, recognizing all too well how quickly political tension could spiral into genuine danger. It was precisely this kind of conflict, alliance politics, territorial disputes, the ever-present threat of war, that had driven her away 5 years ago, convinced her marriage to Darian would only accelerate tensions already simmering beneath the kingdom's surface. Your Majesty, she said carefully, if there's continued danger, perhaps my presence is no longer necessary. You have skilled physicians who can monitor your continued recovery. You're not leaving, Darian said, more forcefully than the moment strictly warranted, surprise flickering across his own features at the sharpness of his response. Forgive me, he added, softer. I simply meant that whoever poisoned me clearly understood herbalism at a level beyond ordinary kitchen staff. If there's continued risk, I'd prefer the healer who identified the poison in the first place remain close enough to catch any further attempts. Of course, Your Majesty, Elara said, though every instinct screamed at her to find any excuse to put distance between herself and a man whose growing recognition felt like watching a slowly collapsing dam. That evening, with Vance occupied organizing additional security and Maeve finally persuaded to rest after 2 sleepless nights, Elara found herself alone with Darian for the first time since her arrival. He was stronger now, sitting upright without obvious strain. Color returned to his face in a way that made the resemblance to the man she remembered even more pronounced. You've been avoiding conversation with me, he observed, watching her prepare his evening dose of silverleaf tea with more focus than the simple task required. Beyond what's strictly necessary for treatment. I didn't realize healers were expected to provide conversation alongside medicine, Your Majesty. Most aren't, he agreed. But most healers also don't flinch every time I study their face too closely, or find sudden, urgent reasons to leave the room whenever my sister raises questions about where they trained. Elara's hands stilled over the tea preparation. I'm not certain what you're suggesting. I'm suggesting, Darian said quietly, that I've spent considerable time these past 2 days, between fever and recovery, trying to understand why a village healer feels so remarkably familiar, why your voice, when you think I'm not fully listening, carries an accent that doesn't quite match the Western territories you claim to hail from. Alara's throat tightened, panic building steadily beneath her carefully maintained composure. Accents shift, Your Majesty. Travel changes speech patterns considerably. Perhaps, Darian allowed, though his tone suggested he found this explanation as unconvincing as his sister apparently had. Or perhaps, he continued, voice dropping lower, more carefully, you remind me so strongly of someone because you are, in fact, precisely who I suspect you might be. Alara's hands trembled slightly as she finished measuring the tea, unable to meet his gaze directly. Your Majesty, I think perhaps the lingering fever is affecting your judgment more than you realize. Perhaps, Darian said again, though this time something sharper edged into his voice. Or perhaps you'd care to explain, healer, why the scar along your jaw appears remarkably consistent with an injury a woman might sustain catching herself badly on broken glass, fleeing through a window in considerable haste 5 years ago, on a morning I remember with painful clarity, despite every effort since to forget it. The teacup slipped from Elara's fingers, shattering against the stone floor, and in the silence that followed, she understood with sinking certainty that there was no version of this conversation left where her careful disguise survived intact. The shattered teacup lay forgotten between them, porcelain fragments scattered across the stone floor, as Elara stood frozen beneath the weight of Darian's unwavering gaze. "Say something," he said quietly, though there was nothing gentle in the stillness of his voice. "Confirm it, or deny it convincingly enough that I'll actually believe you. But don't simply stand there in silence, Elara, after 5 years of wondering whether you were alive or dead." Her name, spoken aloud for the first time in 5 years by the one voice she'd spent that entire time trying to forget, broke something loose in her chest that she'd kept carefully controlled since the morning she'd fled. "I'm sorry," she whispered, which felt entirely inadequate for 5 years of silence, but was the only place she could think to begin. Darian's expression cracked slightly, grief and fury warring visibly beneath his controlled exterior. "Sorry," he repeated. 5 years, Elara. 5 years I searched for you, convinced something terrible had happened, that you'd been taken or harmed, rather than simply choosing to vanish without a single word of explanation. And now you're standing in my chambers, treating my poisoning under a false name, apparently prepared to disappear again without ever telling me why? I was going to leave once you'd recovered. I never meant to stay long enough for you to recognize me. Why?" The word came out rough, wounded in a way that made her chest ache with old guilt she'd never properly resolved. "Why? Did you run, Elara? What did I do that made you flee your own wedding rather than simply telling me whatever fear had taken hold of you?" "You didn't do anything," she said quickly. "It was never about you, Darian. It was about the marriage itself, about what it meant for the kingdom." "Explain," he demanded, properly this time. Not vague half-truths, but the actual reason you left me standing at that altar without a single word. "I was going to leave once you'd recovered. I never meant to stay long enough for you to recognize me." "Why?" The word came out rough, wounded in a way that made her chest ache with old guilt she'd never properly resolved. "Why did you run, Elara? What did I do that made you flee your own wedding rather than simply telling me whatever fear had taken hold of you?" "You didn't do anything," she said quickly. "It was never about you, Darian. It was about the marriage itself, about what it meant for the kingdom." "Explain," he demanded, properly this time, not vague half-truths, but the actual reason you left me standing at that altar without a single word. Elara took a shaking breath. 5 years of carefully buried explanation finally forcing its way toward the surface. "2 days before our wedding," she said slowly, "I overheard a conversation between your advisors. They were discussing how our marriage would be received by the Northern Territories, how it would be seen as provocation, an alliance built specifically to threaten their trade dominance. They spoke of it almost eagerly, like war itself might be a welcome consequence, an opportunity to expand your kingdom's influence through conflict rather than diplomacy." Darian's expression shifted, surprise breaking through his anger. That conversation happened 5 years ago and reflected the opinions of 2 advisors I dismissed shortly afterward, once I discovered their true intentions regarding Northern relations. It was never my intention, Elara. I never wanted war built on the foundation of our marriage. "I didn't know that," she said, voice breaking slightly. I only heard enough to believe our marriage would ignite exactly the kind of conflict I'd spent my whole life terrified of, having grown up watching my own parents' kingdom torn apart by war before I was old enough to understand what caused it. I panicked, Darian. I convinced myself that leaving was the only way to prevent history from repeating itself through me. So you vanished, Darian said, without ever giving me the chance to explain, to correct whatever those advisors had convinced you of, to tell you that I would have chosen peace over conquest every single time, regardless of what anyone else in my court believed was advantageous. I know that now, Elara said miserably. I've had 5 years to understand how badly I misjudged the situation, how much unnecessary pain I caused by running, rather than simply asking you directly what our marriage actually meant for the kingdom's future. 5 years, Darian repeated, something raw and exhausted entering his voice. 5 years I spent believing myself unworthy of love, convinced whatever flaw drove you away was something fundamentally broken in me, rather than simple miscommunication and fear. That's not true, Elara said quickly, moving closer despite every instinct urging caution. None of this was about any flaw in you, Darian. It was entirely my own fear, my own broken understanding of what our marriage might become. I was the one who failed us, not you. Darian studied her for a long, considering moment, old grief and fresh understanding warring visibly across his features. And now, he asked quietly, now that you understand the truth, now that 5 years have passed and circumstances have changed considerably, what do you actually want, Elara? Beyond simply healing my poisoning and disappearing again into whatever careful anonymity you've built for yourself. Elara opened her mouth to answer, uncertain even now what honest response might actually emerge, when the chamber door burst open without warning, Maeve rushing in with obvious alarm. "Your Majesty," she said urgently, "General Vance needs you immediately. They found Corla, and she's naming names none of us expected to hear." Corla was being held in the castle's lower chambers, a thin, frightened woman whose composure had clearly abandoned her entirely by the time Darian, Elara, Maeve, and Vance arrived. "Tell them what you told me," Vance said grimly, standing over the trembling prisoner with obvious, barely controlled fury. Corla's eyes darted toward Darian, fear evident in every line of her body. "I didn't want to do it, Your Majesty. I swear it. They threatened my family, said my children wouldn't survive the winter if I refused." "Who threatened you?" Darian demanded. "Lord Castellan," Corla whispered. "Your own advisor, Your Majesty. He approached me 3 weeks ago, said the Northern Territories were paying handsomely for anyone willing to slow your recovery efforts on the new trade agreements. Said poison disguised as fever would delay negotiations long enough for their preferred outcome to take hold." The room fell into stunned silence. Elara watched Darian's expression shift from fury to something closer to devastated betrayal, understanding immediately the personal weight of discovering an advisor's treachery. "Castellan has served my family for 15 years, Darian said quietly. "My father trusted him completely. He claimed the Northern Territories offered him considerably more than royal service ever could," Corla said miserably. "Said this kingdom's alliance with the East would eventually destroy trade relationships he'd spent decades cultivating personally." "Where is he now?" Vance asked sharply. "I don't know," Corla admitted. "He gave me the Nightbloom route and instructions. then said he'd handle the rest personally. I haven't seen him since 2 days before your fever worsened, Your Majesty. Vance immediately dispatched guards to search Castellan's chambers, though something in his grim expression suggested he already suspected they'd find the advisor long gone, having anticipated exactly this kind of discovery once his co-conspirator's nerve inevitably broke. The search confirmed Vance's suspicion within the hour. Castellan's chambers stood empty, personal belongings hastily packed and removed, correspondence with Northern Territory agents left carelessly behind in his haste to flee before discovery. He's likely already crossed into Northern Territory by now, Vance reported grimly, beyond our immediate reach, protected by whatever alliance he's forged with your enemies. Darian's jaw tightened with barely controlled fury. Then we pursue diplomatic channels, demand his extradition, make clear that attempted regicide carries consequences regardless of which territory currently shelters the perpetrator. And in the meantime, Maev added carefully, we increase security considerably, given that Castellan clearly wasn't acting entirely alone in his assessment of Northern Territory sentiment. Elara listened to this exchange with growing unease, old fears resurfacing despite 5 years of distance and a jagged scar meant to separate her entirely from this world of political conspiracy and royal danger. This is precisely what I feared 5 years ago, she said quietly. Not simply war between kingdoms, but exactly this kind of internal betrayal, conspiracy woven so deeply into royal court that even trusted advisors become willing to commit treason for foreign gain. Darian turned toward her, expression softening slightly despite the tension still gripping the room. This threat exists regardless of whether you're standing beside me or hidden in some distant village, Elara. Castellan's greed, the Northern Territory's ambitions, none of that depends on our marriage specifically. It depends on the ongoing political reality of ruling a kingdom others wish to weaken. I understand that now, Elara admitted, though understanding it 5 years too late doesn't undo whatever damage my absence caused, both to you personally and to whatever trust our marriage might have represented to this kingdom's stability. Perhaps, Darian said carefully, it's not too late to rebuild what fear once convinced you to abandon, if you're willing, that is, to risk trusting me with the truth this time, rather than allowing fear to make decisions neither of us actually chose together. Elara met his gaze, 5 years of careful distance suddenly feeling considerably more fragile than she'd believed possible just days before arriving at this castle. I don't know if I deserve that chance, she said honestly, after everything my absence cost you. That's not your decision to make alone, Darian said quietly. Let me decide what I'm willing to forgive, Elara. You've spent 5 years deciding things on my behalf without ever asking what I actually wanted. I'd ask you not to make that same mistake twice. Elara found him alone that evening, standing at the window of his study, overlooking the same courtyard she'd once crossed as a nervous bride, 5 years and an entire lifetime ago. I keep thinking about what you said, she admitted, joining him at the window, that I made decisions on your behalf without ever asking what you wanted.
Did I say something untrue?
Darian asked, not turning from the window. No, Elara said quietly. That's precisely why it's been sitting so heavily since you said it. He turned to face her then, brown eyes searching her expression with the particular intensity she remembered from before, back when they'd been 2 people building something together, rather than strangers separated by 5 years of careful distance.
I'm not asking you to erase what happened,
Darian said.
I'm not certain either of us could, even if we wanted to. 5 years changed both of us considerably. You learned healing, apparently learned it well enough to identify poison 3 physicians missed entirely. I learned to rule a kingdom while nursing a wound I never properly allowed to heal.
I'm sorry for that wound, Elara said, more sorry than I know how to properly express.
I believe you, Darian said, though sorry alone doesn't answer the question I asked you before Maiev interrupted us. What do you actually want, Elara? Not what you think you deserve or what guilt convinces you might be appropriate penance for 5 years of silence. What do you want, standing here now, with the truth finally between us instead of hidden?
Elara considered the question carefully, aware that whatever answer she gave would determine considerably more than simple politeness required. I want to stop running, she said finally. I've spent 5 years perfecting the art of disappearing, of becoming someone else entirely, rather than facing whatever fear I couldn't properly process. I'm tired of it, Darian. Tired of being Ren, a healer, instead of simply being myself, whatever that actually means anymore. And who is that? Darian asked gently. Who are you, Elara, beneath 5 years of careful disguise and healing skill? I don't entirely know anymore, she admitted. I know I still care about this kingdom's stability, still fear the possibility of war in ways that shaped every decision I made 5 years ago. But I also know running didn't actually solve anything. It simply delayed the same fears, the same political dangers, until they found me anyway, disguised as royal poisoning rather than wedding day panic. Perhaps, Darian said carefully, the answer was never running from danger entirely, but facing it together rather than alone. I've spent 5 years making decisions in isolation, surrounded by advisors I apparently couldn't fully trust, without a partner who might have caught Castellan's betrayal considerably sooner than poison forced the issue. You're suggesting our marriage might have prevented this? Elara said slowly. I'm suggesting, Darian said, that facing danger together tends to produce better outcomes than facing it entirely alone. Whether that danger comes from northern territories or simple fear itself. I'm not naive enough to promise a marriage between us guarantees safety from every future threat, but I no longer believe isolation protects either of us better than partnership would. Elara stepped closer, close enough now that she could see every new line etched around his eyes, 5 years of grief and responsibility carved permanently into features she'd once known as effortlessly confident. I don't deserve a second chance, she said quietly. Not after everything my fear cost you. That's not your decision alone to make, Darian reminded her gently. Let me decide what I'm capable of forgiving, Elara. I've spent 5 years grieving a woman I believed lost forever. Now that same woman stands before me, healed my poisoning, saved my life, and finally told me the truth I deserved 5 years ago. I find myself considerably less interested in dwelling on past mistakes than in discovering whether we might actually build something worth keeping this time, armed with honesty rather than fear. And if I'm still frightened, Elara asked, if old fears resurface, the way they clearly did once already, then you tell me, Darian said simply. Rather than running, you tell me what frightens you, and we face it together rather than allowing fear to make unilateral decisions on both our behalf. That's the only promise I'm asking for, Elara. Not perfection, simply honesty. Elara felt something in her chest finally loosen after 5 years of carefully maintained tension. 5 years of running from exactly this kind of vulnerable honesty she'd convinced herself was too dangerous to risk. I can promise that, she said softly. Honesty, even when it's frightening, even when old fears resurface and running feels considerably easier than staying to face them properly. Darian's hand found hers, warm and familiar despite 5 years of separation, and Elara let herself, for the first time since fleeing that altar, imagine a future built on truth rather than careful disappearance. Then perhaps, Darian murmured, 5 years of separation doesn't have to define whatever comes next. Perhaps we simply begin again, considerably wiser than we were before, and considerably more determined not to let fear make decisions neither of us actually chose together. 3 weeks later, word arrived that Castellan had been captured, attempting to cross back into the kingdom under a false identity, apparently believing enough time had passed for his treachery to be forgotten. Formal charges of conspiracy and attempted regicide awaited him, along with a trial that General Vance assured would proceed with full transparency, ensuring the entire court understood exactly how deeply his betrayal had run. The Northern Territories have distanced themselves from his actions, Maeve reported during a quiet dinner in Darian's chambers, Elara seated beside him now rather than hovering at the room's edge as healer alone. Publicly, at least. Privately, I suspect they're simply disappointed their plot failed, rather than genuinely remorseful about attempting it. Diplomatic relations remain strained, then, Darian said, though his tone carried less anxiety than Elara might have expected given the circumstances. Strained, but not broken, Vance clarified. Your continued survival and Castellan's very public failure sends a clear message about the consequences of underestimating this kingdom's resilience. Elara listened to this political discussion with newfound perspective, understanding now how deeply Darian's advisors valued his judgment, how carefully considered his approach to potential conflict actually was, so entirely different from the reckless warmongering she'd once feared 5 years ago based on a single overheard conversation. You handled this well, she said, once Vance and Maeve had departed for the evening, leaving them alone in the quiet study. Considerably better than I gave you credit for 5 years ago, when fear convinced me you might choose conflict over careful diplomacy. I've had considerable practice since then, Darian said wryly. Ruling alone tends to teach patience rather quickly, whether a king wants that particular lesson or not. You won't have to rule entirely alone anymore, Elara said, quietly, if you're still interested in the offer we discussed. Darian's expression shifted, hope breaking through careful composure in a way that made her chest ache with old affection finally allowed to surface freely. Are you certain, truly certain, Elara, not simply grateful for forgiveness or swept up in the relief of finally telling the truth? I'm certain, she said, and found she meant it completely. 5 years of careful distance finally giving way to something considerably more solid than fear had ever managed to provide. I want to stop running, Darian. I want to build something real with you, armed with honesty rather than the careful disguises I've spent 5 years perfecting. Their second wedding, when it finally happened 2 months later, looked considerably different from the first attempt 5 years earlier. Smaller, for one thing, fewer foreign dignitaries, less elaborate political theater, more genuine warmth radiating from a court that had watched their healer-turned-queen save their king's life before ever learning her true identity. Maeve stood as witness, sharp hazel eyes finally soft with unguarded joy rather than suspicious assessment. Vance stood guard at the ceremony's edge, though his expression suggested he considered this particular duty considerably more pleasant than most. Elara wore blue instead of the elaborate white gown she'd abandoned 5 years before, a small, deliberate choice marking this ceremony as distinctly different from the wedding she'd fled. The scar along her jaw remained visible, unhidden by careful makeup or angle, a permanent reminder of exactly how much both of them had survived to reach this particular moment. "Do you take this woman," the priest asked, "as your true queen and partner, in truth rather than fear?" "I do," Darian said, brown eyes never leaving her face, "more certainly than I've ever committed to anything, including my first attempt at this exact promise 5 years ago." When he kissed her, the entire court erupting into genuine celebration around them, Elara felt 5 years of careful running finally settle into something considerably more permanent than any disguise had ever managed to provide.